Right friends, welcome back to comprehension and vocabulary. This is the 54th session and we are concluding this here for the time being. So, this comprehension and vocabulary, this is the last session and we will start from July or so. We will think about it, I cannot give assurance, but these 54 sessions are available in YouTube at present. Please go through them seriously. And we conducted it for 54 days, comprehension and vocabulary, discussing the editorials. This you can treat as phase 1, and phase 2 we will come up with much more difficult passages, right. So, we are concluding this here, but at the same time for the persons appearing for various competitive examinations, I would like to spend half an hour a day from Monday to Friday, and one day English made simple is there, one day banking awareness current affairs lecture is there on Friday. In addition to that, please give the suggestions whether you require banking awareness questions and answers session, standard GK questions and answers session, or standard GK explanation. So, in my mind I would like to go with Monday to Friday daily half an hour, standard GK on one day, banking questions and answers discussion on one day, then banking current affairs discussion on one day, at the same time English made simple on one day. So, like that I would like to design 5-day program from next week onwards. This 30 minutes will be dedicated to the students appearing for various examinations, and please give your suggestions and we would like to fulfill those suggestions, whether it is a standard GK or bank PO questions and answers, then current affairs questions and answers, then bank discussion, then English made simple. So, these things please give your suggestion. I would like to spend half an hour from Monday to Friday on any of these aspects, probably one day per week for one may be better, and give your honest feedback. And this is the last session in comprehension and vocabulary. You can take them as a phase 1. So, phase 1 ends with the 54th session, and in these 54 sessions I have observed that there are altogether around 500 to 600 new words are there, at least 500 to 600 new words and their usage. And if students are interested, please view the lectures once again, right. So, let us go ahead with the last in the series, that is equity in debt. This is with regard to N.K. Singh committee recommendations, and this is editorial of the Hindu yesterday, and equity in debt here N.K. Singh committee, that I am not going into much details because yesterday we have deliberated on this. This FRBM Act belongs to 2003. Now, N.K. Singh committee was constituted to look at various provisions of FRBM Act, and at present as per FRBM Act, fiscal deficit target is 3% of GDP. And what is the problem? If excess borrowing is there, when excess borrowing is there, it puts unnecessary costs on the future generations and it crowds out private investment. The fiscal irresponsibility may cost the jobs, inflation may take place, domestic currency may be affected, countries may go towards the default situation. And the basic problem is irrational public spending on borrowed money. If the borrowed money is used for creation of assets, then there should not be any problem, right. So, here capital expenditure, if the money is borrowed and it is used for capital expenditure, there is no problem, but the borrowed money is being used for this revenue, that is the biggest problem, right. Then why the N.K. Singh committee was constituted? Because of the reason government could not achieve 3% fiscal deficit, we deliberated yesterday. And what are the recommendations? These things also I deliberated yesterday. Public debt must be the anchor, accumulation of fiscal deficit is public debt, it is to be restricted to 60% of GDP, 40% for the center and 20% for the states. Overall, it is at present 68% of GDP and it is to be restricted to 60% of GDP. So, let us go back. Equity in debt. The expert panel's recommendation, that is encasing committee recommendation to review the Fiscal Responsibility Law, that is FRBM Act of 2003, is timely, right. So, what is meant by equity? Equity has got several meanings. Equity means when you are having shares in NTPC or Mahindra and Mahindra, then you are equity shareholder. That means one of the equal parts into which the value of the company is divided. So, based on that the share value is decided. Then the situation in which everyone is treated equally and fairly, that is equity. Our growth should have the element of equity, that is the situation in which everyone is treated fairly and equally. A fair judgment where the existing laws are not satisfactory. So, here the meaning of equity is fair judgment. Equity in debt means fair judgment in debt, right. So, this is the exact meaning here. The advice of the expert committee to review FRBM Act of 2003 requires attention. So, the recommendations of encasing committee requires attention given India's track record. This is all the more so given the born again political conviction that promises of random largesse to voters is just fine. What is the meaning of the second sentence? This is all the more so, that means this is more relevant today because initially Modi government from 2014, in fact initially it was against subsidies like waiver of farm loans, but now the BJP government in Uttar Pradesh waived farm loans. Now, the born again political conviction, that promises of random largesse, in random way, generously things are being granted without any basis, and again we are seeing this culture, that is why born again is given. So, the committee recommendations are significant as born again, that means the conviction which was born again, that promises of random largesse to voters is fine. Here conviction is a firmly held belief or opinion is conviction, and random is without any method, selecting in random way, and largesse means money or gifts given generously, that is largesse. So, here random largesse, that means now farm loan waivers are decided on random basis without any rationalism, right. So, this encasing committee recommendations are more important now because the born again political conviction that promises of random largesse to voters is just fine. Change in the perception of the government now, randomly they are generously waiving off certain loans, and this is the conviction which born again under these circumstances to put brakes on the government's revenue expenditure. This stringent law to restrict public debt is required. That is the meaning of this paragraph, right. Excessive and unsustainable borrowing. If you borrow something, it is okay. To construct a house, it is okay, but you are borrowing and going to 5-star hotel, is it okay? Definitely it is not okay. Excessive and unsustainable borrowing by the government is obviously perverse, as it entails a cost on future generations while crowding out private investment. So, when more money is borrowed, right. So, excessive and unsustainable borrowing by the government is obviously perverse. What is the meaning of perverse? Perverse is deliberate desire to behave in a way that is unreasonable or unacceptable. The deliberate desire to behave in such a way that is unreasonable or unacceptable, that is perverse behavior, right. So, here the point is excessive borrowing is perverse as it entails, that means as it results in cost on future generations, means the future generation have to pay back the interest. So, whenever whatever money we are borrowing, that puts cost on the future generations. If a father borrows more money, then son has to pay back in future. So, that is the meaning of this sentence, and it crowds out private investment. When government is borrowing more money, then the space or scope for private investment is reduced. In the past, fiscal irresponsibility, that means borrowing more money has cost jobs. In fact, in the past, because of borrowing more money, it had effect on the jobs, spiked inflation, increased inflation, put the currency in a tailspin. So, what is the meaning of tailspin? Please look into this. Perverse we have discussed. Spike means increase. I have already told you. Spike in inflation, spike in oil prices. Then tailspin means rapidly increasing chaos or panic. When rapidly increasing panic is there, that is a tailspin. So, come back to the passage. In fact, spiked inflation put the currency in a tailspin and even brought the country to the brink of a default. At the same time, it brought the country to the brink of a default. In 1990, 1991, the country witnessed, or you can say on the verge of default. Brink means at the stage where it is going to reach, you see, a point where a new or different situation is about to begin. So, at the brink of collapse we call, you see, during the 2008 financial crisis, many companies were on the brink of bankruptcy. Brink of bankruptcy means on the verge of bankruptcy, or you can say on the point of reaching bankruptcy, right. The possibility of default may have resulted in the liberalization of economy in 1991. We have gone for new economic policy of 1991, and the possibility of default may have resulted in the liberalization of the economy in 1991, but the key trigger was irrational public spending on the borrowed money in the late 80s. I have already told you, when you are borrowing money, then use it for construction of house. That is good. But when you are borrowing money and spending lavishly of visiting 3-star hotels, 5-star hotels, it is not good. So, but the key trigger was irrational public spending of borrowed money of 1980s. The possibility of default may have resulted in the liberalization of economy of 1991, but the key trigger means something which causes something to start. Here, an event or situation that causes something to start, normally initiation for something bad, right. The trigger was irrational public spending on the borrowed money. Less than a decade later, that means less than a decade later, the fiscal discipline faltering and the deficit shooting up to 10% of GDP. So, 1991 new economic policy, subsequently in less than 10 years, the deficit, that means fiscal deficit, shot up to 10% of GDP. At present it is 3.2% for 2017-18, and it reached up to 10% of GDP. He is talking about around 2001 or so. The FRBM law was enacted to limit the government's borrowing authority. This FRBM law was enacted to limit the government's borrowing authority under Article 268. This is wrong in the editorial, this is the wrong, probably it is not 268. I could not recollect the exact article of the constitution, but it is not 268, and the FRBM law was enacted to limit the government's borrowing authority. That means FRBM Act was brought, it brought restrictions, borrowing must not exceed 3%, previously it was 10%, but the target to limit the fiscal deficit to 3% of GDP by 2009 was abandoned after the 2008 global financial crisis. But it was abandoned after 2008 global financial crisis as a liberal stimulus reversed the gains in the fiscal space. Liberal stimulus means when the economy is not growing, then some boost is required with more government spending, that is economic stimulus. Economic stimulus can happen by reduction of the taxes or by increasing the government expenditure. So, the fiscal gains were thrown to the winds subsequent to 2008 global financial crisis, creating fresh macro level instability, right, creating fresh macro level instability. The FRBM Act's deficit target is now only likely to be met next year. So, that 3% is going to be met by 2018-19. Trigger, I have explained you already, irrational, not logical or reasonable. Something without reason is irrational. Then falter. Falter means lose strength or momentum, move unsteadily, that is faltering. In recent times, several countries are beginning to falter because of the policies of the new regime. So, falter means basically move unsteadily or lose strength or momentum, right. Such damage transmissions from the political economy to the real economy need to be checked forthwith. So, excessive spending happened in 1980s, resulted in new economic policy of 91. Subsequently, fiscal deficit shoot up to 10% by 2001. Subsequently, to limit the borrowing, FRBM Act was brought in 2003. As per FRBM Act, fiscal deficit is required to be restricted to 3% by 2009. But FRBM Act was thrown to the winds because of 2008 financial crisis, and even now also after the passage of FRBM Act for 14 years period, this could not be achieved. Now also it is 3.2%. Under these circumstances, now the government appointed this committee. The committee's proposal to maintain the 3% target till 1920 before aiming for further reduction is pragmatic. Before aiming for further reduction, this 3% target up to 2019-20 is pragmatic. What is the meaning of pragmatic? Pragmatic means solving the problems in a sensible way depending on the circumstances. Taking the decisions depending on the circumstances, solving the problems in a sensible way is known as pragmatic, right. So, it is reasonable as the extraordinary unanticipated domestic development of demonetization happened during its tenure. Such an event, the committee has said, could trigger an escape clause from fixed fiscal targets in its proposed rule-based framework. It suggested an escape clause also. Escape clause means if some unavoidable conditions or some difficult circumstances, if at all they arise, we have to go for escape clause of 0.5% beyond the fixed target, right. Instead of focusing purely on the fiscal and revenue deficit numbers, which should be brought down to 2.5% and 0.8% by 2023, here fiscal deficit 2.5% by 2023 0.8% by 2023. This is revenue deficit target, and instead of focusing purely on these, the panel has called for paring India's cumulative public debt as a proportion of GDP to 60% by 2023. As I have already told you, this accumulation of fiscal deficit over the years becomes public debt, and at present public debt for both the center and the states put together is 68%, and it is to be restricted to 60% by 2023, 40% for center, 20% for states. The latter, a simpler measure for solvency purposes, should inspire confidence among rating agencies. So, if the public debt is limited to 60% instead of 68%, then it is the simpler measure for calculating solvency, and this should infuse confidence among the rating agencies, or you can say global rating agencies, right. So, this is the difference between capital expenditure and revenue expenditure. Capital means construct new highways, and repairing them is revenue expenditure. Establishing new machinery to create jobs is capital expenditure, because some new factory, if it is established, it will create jobs for the generations to come, right. Though this has put paid to the government's hope that a fiscal deficit range could be targeted instead of absolute numbers, though this has put faith to the government's hope that a fiscal deficit range could be targeted instead of absolute numbers, the finance minister has committed to 3% target for the next 2 years from the 3.2% target for 17-18. So, in future, overall, the 60% GDP target, 60% public debt target will be fixed. Though this has put paid to the government's hope that a fiscal deficit range could be targeted instead of absolute numbers, the government's hope is they will give, in fact, this is absolute, instead of absolute target of 3% or 3.5%, the government expected the range somewhat 2.5% to 4%, something like that, but the committee has not accepted to that. Instead of the range, it suggested the public debt anchor. The finance minister anyhow committed to 3% and 3.2%, 3.2% this year, next 2 years 3%, a clear fiscal policy framework, how much is to be borrowed, all those things will be evident in the fiscal policy framework in tandem with the monetary policy framework already adopted. Monetary policy framework already adopted. What is monetary policy framework? Monetary policy framework which already adopted stipulates the inflation in the range of 4% plus or minus 2%. So, already monetary policy framework is in place, and what is required is fiscal policy framework. So, as to achieve 60% of public debt in comparison to GDP must be achieved, for that fiscal policy framework is the need of the hour, and that could act as powerful signal of commitment to macroeconomic stability. In tandem means we discussed yesterday, at the same time, and macroeconomy, microeconomy difference is macroeconomy, it sees on larger perspective, it looks at the behavior of the economy as a whole, looking at GDP, inflation, unemployment, investment, savings, right. So, this is in the macroeconomic perspective means it looks at main indices, and if you look at microeconomy, micro means small, it looks at demand supply elasticity of individual companies or entities. This is the difference between macroeconomy and microeconomy. So, to ensure macroeconomic stability, government, just like monetary policy framework, should come up with the fiscal policy framework also, right. Then PARA, that is Public Sector Asset Rehabilitation Agency, probably this is not required here, let us leave this. The center must swiftly take a call on the panel's recommendations. The central government must swiftly means fast, as fast as possible. So, the central government must act fast. Take a call means take a decision. In passages, when someone comes across take a call, that means this is the time to take a decision, it should not be further delayed. Swift means fast. So, the center must swiftly take a call on the panel's recommendations, including for a new debt and fiscal responsibility law, new debt and fiscal responsibility law, new debt and fiscal responsibility law, and the creation of a fiscal council to look at the implementation of fiscal responsibility law. Monetary policy framework is there, and to look at it, monetary policy committee is there. Similarly, please bring fiscal policy framework at the same time, just like monetary policy committee, to look at the implementation of fiscal policy. Please bring a fiscal council with independent experts that could sit in judgment on the need for deviations from the targets. If at all escape clause of 0.5% is required, then that fiscal council will take the decision. It is equally critical that states are brought on board. On board means for specific reason, as part of a group. So, to make Swachh Bharat success, village level administration must be taken on board to make Swachh Bharat a success. On board means especially for a specific purpose, bringing the people together is known as on board. And let us look at the next sentence. It is equally critical that the states must also be brought together, as the 60% debt target includes 20% on their account. Their finances are worsening again, even as the clamour for Uttar Pradesh style loan waivers grows. As the clamour for Uttar Pradesh loan waivers grows. What is the meaning of clamour? Clamour means a strongly expressed protest or demand from large number of people is known as clamour. There is a clamour for waiver of agricultural loans, right. So, the point here is this encasing committee recommendations must be accepted, and necessary framework for implementation of the fiscal responsibility law must be brought, and fiscal council must be established so as to look at whether it is being properly implemented or not. Right friends, this concludes our first part of comprehension lectures. This is 54th, this is the last lecture. So, the phase 1 of this comprehension lectures ends here, and from next week onwards we will come up with a mechanism of one every day, like standard GK, current affairs discussion, banking awareness Q&A discussion. Like that, we will come up from next week with the mechanism of discussion of questions and answers for various banking and other examinations. Right friends, this first phase ends here, 54 lectures, and we will start phase 2 of the lectures by increasing the difficulty level at appropriate time, right. So, with this, please enjoy all these lectures. If anyone has got any doubt, please view once again. It will increase your word power. You can easily understand comprehension passages, and this methodology is well designed by keeping in the students, basically rural students, whoever are not conversant with English vocabulary and comprehension. Right friends, have a nice day. Thank you.